Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and can I welcome you very sincerely and very warmly to this third Dean's Lecture for the 2013 series. We've had three in 3 weeks, quite rapid. The next one's early September. But tonight's lecture, as you know, is being presented by Bob Pianta, and clearly we have a full house, so I thank you all for your support tonight. I'd like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people who are the traditional custodians of this land, and I pay respects to elders both past and present of the Kulin Nation. Most of you know the format because many of you have been here before, but at the conclusion I've invited Professor Colette Taylor to move a vote of thanks, and then I invite you all to join me and Bob and others outside in the foyer for some light refreshments. So it is with great pleasure indeed that I introduce Professor Bob Pianta. Bob is the Novartis Professor of Education and Dean of the Curry School of Education at the University of Virginia. I think when I was Dean it was the very first school of education that I visited to find out how top schools of education did things. I think that was a lesson that we've taken on board quite nicely. The Curry School of Education is, of course, at the University of Virginia. He's the founding director of the Centre of Advanced Study of Teaching and Learning and a professor of psychology. Bob earned his BS and an MA in Special Education from the University of Connecticut and a PhD in Psychology from Minnesota. He joined the University of Virginia in 1986 and began his appointment as Dean in 2007. It's more than 250 articles, 50 book chapters, 10 books, and has been principal investigator in over $55 million worth of grants. Many of you would be aware that his research focuses on investigating the effects of schooling on children's social and academic outcomes, and on improving classroom experiences through teachers' professional development. Bob is creator of the Classroom Assessment Scoring System. Many of you know that as CLASS, an observational assessment of teacher-student interactions with versions for use with infants through to 12th grade students. The CLASS supports efforts to assess and improve teacher effectiveness, and it does it on a wide scale. It's now used by every Head Start program in the US, affecting 50,000 teachers and over 500,000 students. I call that high impact research. Bob has also led the development of a system of proven effective professional development supports known as My Teaching Partner. He is a nationally recognised expert in both early childhood education and K-12 teaching and learning. So with this background, Bob and his team have been ideal intellectual reference group for Professor Colette Taylor's group here through the E for Kids project and our own Early Childhood Master of Teaching team. He and Anne love their sport. They were introduced to the MCG and Aussie rules on Sunday. Bob completed yet another marathon about 6 months ago. Anne didn't do that one, but she has run marathons and she ran with him for the last 6 miles and said, "You are going well, Bob, aren't you?" or words to that effect. But crazily, they both did their first parachute jump in New Zealand last week. So it's with that sense of adventure that it gives me great pleasure to welcome to the lectern Professor Bob Pianta, who will present Improving Impacts of Classrooms, Professional Development and Observation of Teacher-Student Interactions. Please welcome Bob.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Field. It is a great pleasure to be here. I've very much enjoyed my visit here, and Anne and I have both enjoyed Melbourne tremendously for the last several days. I've said on a number of different occasions, this is now one of my new favorite cities. It's really been delightful, and the work that's happening here in the Graduate School of Education is just remarkable. The teacher preparation program is doing so many of the things that, in some ways, I wish we were doing more of actually at the Curry School. Really, I think establishing a leading edge for how you advance teacher preparation, and also had a great meeting yesterday with folks from the Department of Education and Early Childhood doing very good work. So I also want to thank you all for being here tonight. I hear that there's a soccer game in town, and you know, we've at least seen an awful lot of people wearing red on the sidewalk. So, what I'd like to do is really spend the evening talking about a range of research that we've been doing over the last almost 2 decades that have first established a descriptive base for the kinds of experiences that are offered for young children in early education programs, with a focus particularly on the interactions between teachers and children and establishing the degree to which those interactions can be measured and actually matter. And then if we actually can describe interactions and we can measure interactions, then the next question is really, can we improve them? And how can observation actually leverage our efforts to improve the quality of experiences and outcomes for kids? And ultimately, does that contribute to some improvements in student learning outcomes? And most of the talk will focus on early education settings, but a lot of what we'll talk about is very applicable all the way up to 12th grade. And I'll allude a couple times to some of the ways that we're extending this work in some basic science in our lab. So we're going to start with teachers and teaching. I don't think I could ask you all to raise your hand and remember the qualities of a teacher that made a difference for you, and all of us have one of those teachers. We're lucky if we have more than one of those teachers. And I think oftentimes a lot of what I'll talk about tonight will resonate with some of the experiences that we've had with those teachers. But the problem is, and I suspect this is probably the case in Australia as well, in the United States, having an effective teacher is really a matter of luck. And actually we've established that empirically, that you're basically lucky to get the kind of teachers that we all know are those effective teachers that make a difference for us. We're using all sorts of ways to try to improve the quality of teaching in classrooms. We even go so far as to, we do a lot of assessment of kids. We compute the gain scores for those kids from year to year. We attribute those gains to individual teachers. And we go so far as to post teachers' gain scores, or average gain scores, in the newspaper, thinking that somehow by posting individual teachers' names and the kind of gains that their children make on achievement tests is actually somehow going to contribute to improving the quality of instruction and teaching in classrooms. And I think that's probably not, that's a bit of a bridge too far. We also think about trying to apply sort of market-based solutions like firing teachers at the lowest 10% or whatever the case may be. But a lot of this doesn't deal with the fundamental issue, which is how do we produce effective teaching? How do we produce effective teachers in the classroom? And even though you know, we are able to isolate various factors within schooling that contribute to children's achievement, and over again we see that this issue of early and the individual teacher matters the most. And in fact, a longitudinal study just done, completed, a follow-up study completed after kids had been randomly assigned to their first grade kindergarten teacher and followed them up when they were 25 years old, is demonstrating that the return to an individual student, a child, who happens to land in an effective kindergarten teacher's classroom, the return to them by the time they're 25 years old is about $320,000. That's net income, educational value, and the like. So these teachers really do matter, and it matters to start early. On the other hand, we have a lot of evidence that the money that we plow into trying to improve the quality of teachers and teaching, particularly from a professional development standpoint, is not all that well utilized or impactful. So again, in the US, we spend roughly between $2,000 and almost $10,000 per teacher per year to try to improve the quality of instruction in classrooms. And for the most part, there's almost no evidence that investment actually is returning anything. So our work, the work we've been trying to do over the course of the last 2 decades now, is to say, how do we begin to move from luck Okay, I got lucky I got Mrs. Smith for second grade, to a guarantee. That effective teachers are in every classroom, and our focus is on actually the production of effective teaching. Importantly, scale is really an issue here. So in the United States, we're supplying almost 500,000 teachers, new teachers a year, to the workforce. So whatever solutions we come up with for producing teachers, we've got to do it at a level that produces a lot of those teachers over time. Okay. Our starting point for this work is the interactions between adults and children, but particularly between teachers and children. And again, because we're focusing early, we'll focus on those interactions and the value of them in early childhood. But really, there's very good evidence that the early history of relationships with adults, between children and adults, really forms the infrastructure for success in school. So kids derive skills around social competence with peers, their ability to self-regulate and demonstrate self-control, and things like task orientation, persistence, following directions. All that comes from the features of interaction between young children and care providers, young children and parents. And by and large, those are the things that most kindergarten teachers will say, if kids show up with these kind of skills, then I'm ready to teach them. Learning, we would argue, and this is an argument we would make both in the early childhood world, but increasingly in the K-12 world. Another reason to look at interactions is that learning itself is a social process. Okay, that a teacher who's instructing a group of children is doing so in the context of the relationships and the social interactions she has with those children. It's not as if those relationships sit over to the side and she just teaches. That in fact, instruction itself is a social process. And we would argue, and this is part of what we're seeing in policy now in the United States, that relationships or interactions are really the benchmark for the quality of early education programming. I would argue they're probably the benchmark for K-12 education as well. So our work starts with the idea of, can we develop a set of standardized observational assessments for those interactions and how we would leverage those. We divide the universe of teacher-child interaction into three large buckets, okay? And we'll talk about these throughout the talk. So there's one group of interactions, or the value of interactions, that provide emotional supports to children. These are the things that teachers do to make children feel safe, secure, motivated to learn, a sense of connection in the classroom. They're also the things that teachers do that organize the classroom. How do they manage behavior? How do they manage time? And then for us, there's a bucket we call instructional support, but this is not instruction in the sense of how the teacher manages a lesson. This is instruction in terms of the ways in which teachers provide feedback to kids, the way they stretch their thinking and conceptual development. So it's really about the cognitive press that's created through teacher-student interactions. We measure those interactions using the tool that Phil mentioned in his introduction, the classroom assessment scoring system, that rates where an observer goes into a classroom and rates the interaction that they see the teacher displaying on a scale of 1 to 7, 1 being low, 7 being high, and we'll talk about that a little more as we go. And the class is used in a variety of ways that are suggested up there. So here's another way of looking at those three broad buckets running down the right side: organization support, emotional support, and instructional support. And these bullets running down the left side would be the dimensions of interactions, or the features of interactions, that an observer would go into a classroom, and there's lots of detail in terms of how one codes these things, a lot of training that goes into coding these things. But at the end of the day, the observer's tasked with assigning a 1 to 7 rating on things like teacher sensitivity, productivity, quality of feedback. Okay? Each one of these scales has an element to it that captures the back and forthness of the teacher's engagement with the child. So something like sensitivity is capturing the teacher's attunement to individual kids, and is she timing her responses to children's cues in a way that is quick, is readily experienced by the child, and is effective. Well, regard for student perspectives is indicating, is the teacher's interaction displaying features that indicate that she is aware of the perspective of the children in that classroom on her interactions, or is it just sort of driving down the highway no matter what the kids are thinking? And then there's things like timing of the behavior management. Is it proactive behavior management? Is it behavior management that works into a sequence of early misbehavior in ways that brings kids back into the classroom and into the flow of interaction? Or is it behavior management that is more punitive and harsh and usually ends up with the kid in timeout or out in the hallway? Productivity, how fast does it, not how fast, but how well is time used? Or are kids spending a lot of time waiting around for the next thing to happen? And then on instructional support, is the teacher really focused on stretching kids' concepts and their understanding conceptually, or is it really just focused on learning rote facts? Okay. Feedback, is it feedback that stretches kids' thinking and stretches kids' performance, or is it feedback that just simply says, yes, no, you got it right, let's move on to the next person? Okay. So that's generally the way that we approach observing interaction in the classroom, and we go in and we'll spend, trained observers go in, we watch for 20 minutes, they assign scores on the basis of these scales, and then they watch for another 20 minutes, assign some other scores, and then we aggregate those scores together for an overall score that represents the quality of interaction from that observation. Okay. So that's kind of the way we go about articulating the landscape of teacher-child interaction in these three broad buckets and those domains. This is what happens when we go out and observe. These are observations from more than really, at this stage, probably several tens of thousands of classrooms in early education, U.S. early education, from pre-K to the first or second grades. And here's essentially what you see in these three domains. If we're rating going from low to high, you see that there's a reasonable that in a sense the modal classroom in early education is socially a fairly positive place. It's reasonably well organized, but in terms of the cognitive press that's provided for kids in those classrooms, it's quite low. And essentially what this means is that these classrooms are really focused around rote learning and discrete facts, not kids' conceptual understanding or providing much feedback to them. I will say that if I were to take this tool and use it in 6th to 12th grade classrooms in the U.S., which we've just done in a big study funded by the Gates Foundation, you would see essentially the exact same thing. Okay, you see instructions up a little higher, and organizations up a little higher, and emotional support's a little lower. But again, the same idea being that the typical classroom is very rote-oriented. This may in large part be a function, at least in K-12 education, of our focus on standardized testing and very narrow tests, that the curriculum has become a real test-driven curriculum. In early education, I don't think that's necessarily the case. All right, so that's the way classrooms kind of look. Let's, and hopefully I've convinced you a little bit that we can measure these interactions using a tool like class. But let's look at some of the evidence about whether the degree to which interactions contribute to children's development. So here we have a study of about this is well over 1,000 classrooms for 4-year-old children in the United States. Most of these classrooms are serving a range of kids. They include classrooms that are Head Start classrooms, but they're also our state-funded, if you will, pre-kindergarten programs. And here are the indicators of school readiness that we'd be interested in assessing on kids, and we assess these at the beginning of the year and at the end of the year. And then there's a number of different ways of looking at the quality of programs. And this is actually an early version of the class that just had emotional support and instructional support. This is the Early Childhood Environment Rating Scale total score, which is the ECHRS is really a mixture of features of the physical environment as well as the presence of curricula and other features of the classroom and aspects of teacher-child interaction. And then there's structural features of programs, which are whether the teacher has a bachelor's degree or just an associate's degree, or the ratio in the classroom, or the number of children in the classroom, or whether it's a full day or a part day program. The kind of features of programs that actually are the things that policymakers pay a lot of attention to and argue about a lot. So if you look here, the checks really represent a significant association between a marker of quality and children's school readiness gains. And so here you see, essentially the short story here is that interactions matter, and that the features of instructional support that we observe in the class significantly contribute to gains in these kind of learning outcomes for kids over the course of the pre-K year, and the emotional support features are predicting to those social and emotional outcomes for kids. The Eckers total does contribute there, but here the other big story is that these structural features don't contribute at all. That the kinds of things that we spend lots of time trying to regulate, okay, and arguing about all the time. I mean, we have this huge debate, and again, I don't know the context here in Australia, but a huge debate about whether teachers in early childhood should have a bachelor's degree or not. And in fact, we find no evidence over and over again that the bachelor's degree matters. What matters is what teachers know and do. And if you build those things into a bachelor's degree, then you've got a bachelor's degree that matters. But the garden variety bachelor's degree, which is what that represents, doesn't matter as much as we would like it to matter. And it's an expensive thing for people to have to do. We just, this is a study, again, this is probably about 5 or 6 years ago. We just took this, this study, and this will be a paper published in Science in the next couple of weeks, where we took, so we have these 50 states, right? And these, we have 14 states that are using a policy tool called a quality rating and improvement system, which measures not just only these kinds of elements of quality, but that row would run out all the way over here. So many of these states have 10 or 12 different quality indicators that they collect data on, and then they roll these indicators up into a system where programs are assigned 1 star, 2 star, 3 star, 4 stars, and with the stars trying to signal a level of quality to the public that can then be, kind of serve as a market basis for parents to purchase higher star quality for their kids, and these kind of things. So when we do this with these we have these 14 states, and we simulated whether those quality rating and improvement systems actually predicted anything about children's school readiness. And in fact, they don't. None of those increasing numbers of stars were predicting to higher levels of school readiness for kids. The only time that those higher level stars predicted to increased school readiness for kids was if the quality rating and improvement system included the class or included the Eckers. Okay? So it matters to get into classrooms. It matters to see what the real experiences are for kids, that these structural features are very, very indirect markers of quality in the way that quality matters. So those kids that in that study that I just showed, they went from pre-K to kindergarten, right? They go to the next year. So the question, you might raise the question, well, do those pre-K experiences predict to how well they're going to do in kindergarten? And in fact, we tested the kids again at the end of the kindergarten year, and we found that the kids who in pre-K had higher levels of instructional support with their teacher were actually they were doing better at the end of kindergarten regardless of the quality of their kindergarten classroom. So experiences in pre-K forecasted how well kids were doing in kindergarten. Again, you can imagine if you're learning a little more in pre-K, right, then you're probably doing a little bit better so that you can get a little bit more out of your kindergarten experience. And in fact, if you had a good kindergarten experience, that adds a little bit more to your value, so to your achievement and school readiness. So it's this idea that that these experiences with interactions in classrooms accumulate over time is a really important one, and we've been able to establish it here. And in fact, we've actually established in that study that even 1-point gains on a measure like the classes are pretty helpful. We'll come back to that in a moment. And the other thing that we've looked at is the degree to which interactions are important, not just for essentially all kids, but are they which they are, but are they even more important for children who are coming from more vulnerable backgrounds? Okay, so one can imagine that it's nice to be in an effective kindergarten teacher's classroom, and everyone can gain some value from that. But for kids that are coming from tougher circumstances, the hypothesis would be that in fact those interactions might be even more important to them. So let's look at that a little bit. Here we're looking at first grade achievement. These are literacy test scores that have been adjusted. These are post-test literacy scores in the spring that have been adjusted for kids' fall scores. You can think of them as sort of learning gains during the course of the year. And we're going to look at what happens to kids who get sorted into classrooms, first grade classrooms that we would rate as low, middle, or high on instructional support. Now, actually, low, middle, and high is just taking the distribution, cutting it in thirds. Okay, nothing fancy here. And we're going to look at this for kids who come from a background in which the mothers had a college education or more, or kids who came from a family background with less education than that. Okay, so here you see these may look a little different, but they're not from one another. The kids coming from a high education background, they make the same amount of gains in reading no matter what kind of first grade classroom teacher they have, because most of these gains are really a function of what happens in the family. Okay? But for kids who are coming from low education backgrounds, look at the difference it makes the kind of the first grade teacher's classroom you end up with. So here we find that the kids from low education backgrounds are making as much gain in that first grade year as their more well-educated family background counterparts. For these children, the achievement gap is increasing, okay, that year. It's increasing, okay? Now we're going to look at the same sort of outcomes, again, literacy outcomes, first grade, but here we're going to look at the qualities of emotional support that are provided to kids in that first grade classroom. Okay, again, low, middle, and high. We just cut the distribution in thirds. And we're going to look at this for two groups of kids. Again, we're looking at sort of riskier kids, that first group of riskier kids coming from low education families. This group of risky kids are kids whose kindergarten teacher at the end of the year filled out, we had them fill out a bunch of questionnaires. And these are kids whose teachers identified them as having, they identified them in the top level of their classroom in terms of problems with adjustment. And for the most part, that means these kids were kind of disruptive at the end of the kindergarten year. That's mostly what this means. They didn't pay attention very well, and they displayed disruptive behavior. So you have kids who have those kinds of problems in this group, and you have kids who the kindergarten teacher said was very well adjusted in that group. So that's the well-adjusted group. Again, doesn't matter what sort of classroom you sort yourself into and you're learning. This is the group, again, for multiple problems. And here we're looking at behavior problems that the kids are displaying, and it mattering the degree to which the emotional support is provided to you in the classroom, translating into your literacy test scores. Okay, so we have a crossover between social development, social support, and literacy scores here. And again, you have the kids sorting into that low group, the achievement gap increasing. Okay, so that's the early side of the equation, pre-K and first grade. And we're sort of essentially trying to make the argument that, again, these interactions can be measured and that they matter for children's learning and social development. So what happens when you look at 6th to 12th grade? So we've actually looked at this in a couple of different studies now, using the older age version of the class. And the older age version of the class looks almost just like that pre-K to 5 version that I put up there. Has the same sort of dimensions, the same domains. But obviously, for something like teacher sensitivity, we're looking at behaviors that are different when we look at teachers with 11th graders and we're looking at teachers of 4-year-olds, right? So here we have a study, one smaller study where we looked at predicting the state standards test scores for about 2,000 kids in 100 classrooms. And again, we see moderate effect sizes across all content domains. So this was interesting to us, so that the class itself, particularly as we move into the secondary grades, people always ask us about, well, what about content? Are you watching the teacher's math teaching? Are you watching the teacher's history teaching? And we're just watching interactions. We're not watching what she's doing with the math or what she's doing with the history. We're watching how she's engaging kids through her interactions. And we find that across all content domains, we still see significant associations between features of interaction and children's outcome. That means, that sensitivity matters whether the teacher's teaching math or the teacher's teaching history or the teacher's teaching science. And it matters equally across those subject areas. And it also is predicting student engagement. And interestingly, when we observe a teacher 1 year, and then we look at the children that she's teaching the next year, the observations of her in the first year are actually also predicting the kind of learning the amount of learning that's going on even the subsequent year with the children that are being taught that second year. So essentially we're observing something about teachers that looks like it's contributing to learning on a stable basis, that it's capturing something about the teachers that's stable. We've also replicated this study this result in a measures of effective teaching study. This is the Gates MET study that's with about 4,000 classrooms, where we see, again, this association between teacher-student interactions as assessed by the class and value-added scores on student achievement. Okay, so this tries to get us to the point that we can measure interactions, we can do it in lots and lots of classrooms, and what we measure, what we're observing, seems to matter for student learning, okay? So if we get to that point, then the next big challenge is, can we improve these interactions, right? Because it's great to be able to measure them, it's great to be able to describe them, but unless we can improve them, then we probably haven't gone as far as we really want to go here. So we're particularly interested in our improvement in, how do we link these inputs to teachers with their interactions with kids? So the class provides us with a target for interactions. So the class, as it defines interactions, becomes our target for professional development. Okay? So I want to improve your instructional support. I want to improve your sensitivity. And those definitions of instructional support and sensitivity become our target for professional development. So we have 3 different ways that we've tried to do that. The first is through a video library. Okay? And this basically gives people examples of other teachers' interactions. So you might say, okay, that's great, Bob. I buy it that, sensitivity is important. Show me an example, okay? And the video library shows examples of high levels of sensitivity, or teachers we've assessed as demonstrating sensitivity. We have a model of coaching where this provides ongoing analysis and feedback to teachers about their own interactions. I'll describe that in a moment. And then we actually built a college course that tries to teach teachers about interactions and help develop their own observation skills. All of these have been tested in experiments, so we think this is very important. If we are going to talk about using evidence to drive change in teacher preparation, or we're going to talk about evidence to drive change in professional development out on the field, then the bar for evidence ought to be experiments. If I'm wanting to claim to you that a professional development model is effective, you should ask me, where's the experiment? A random assignment experiment of teachers into treatment and control groups. Okay, this is an example of the video library. People can hop on and they might want to say, well, show me a video of sensitivity. And this would be an example of a video clip on sensitivity. Two things that are very important about the video library. One is, these are short clips, okay? We really want to constrain a viewer's view of what they see. We want to train essentially the library, the viewing of clips on a library, to train an observer to see interactions at a moment-to-moment detailed level. And these annotations are all written in a very standard way. They are written to describe the larger dimension, in this case it would be sensitivity, and then most of it is a description of the moment-to-moment interactions that are taking place and what the teacher's doing on a moment-to-moment basis in that. These are not general descriptions of teacher sensitivity in early childhood education. They are very, very granular descriptions of what that teacher's doing in that video clip to demonstrate sensitivity toward that child or a group of children. Okay? When we coach, we have teachers capture video of themselves now, and that video is sent to a coach. Usually this is sent over the internet to a coach. All this coaching occurs over the internet remotely. So the teacher captures herself on a lesson, sends that lesson to a coach. The coach takes that lesson and edits that video into 3, again, very short clips, okay? The first of which is identifying on that video an example of the teacher doing a good job, okay? Basically demonstrating the behavior that they're trying to coach on. So I might be coaching a teacher on sensitivity, for example. My first clip would be pulling out an example of a teacher's sensitive behavior, the teacher that I'm coaching. And then there's 2 clips that follow that. The clips and the written feedback that the coach makes around those clips, those 3 clips, is posted on an internet site that the teacher can then go to and see the coach's the clips that the coach pulled and the annotations and feedback that go with that. I'll show you that in a moment. And that then the teacher and the coach typically meet virtually via Skype or the phone. And that cycle, this is what we call a coaching cycle, repeats itself asynchronously over the course of the academic year. So it's the same cycle repeats over and over again. This is an example of what a teacher would see if she was being coached. And in this case, this is a secondary student, a teacher in a secondary classroom, where a clip has been pulled. There's what we call a prompt. This is the feedback to the teacher that describes what the teacher's doing on a moment-to-moment basis very quickly, and then is asking the teacher a question that is intended to drive that teacher's analysis of herself on the video, again, around, in this case, sensitivity. And then the teacher writes an answer to the question here. So she does that 3 times to 3 clips in each coaching cycle. Okay. And then the course is, the purpose of the course is to do these things over here, identify connections between interactions and learning, to describe elements of effective interactions, and label them. So the course is a college course about interactions that's driven around the class as the language and the lens for interactions, and is trying to train the students in that course in an ability to see and interpret interactions in video. So there's a lot of video used in the course too. Okay, so there's a strong emphasis on video review. Okay, so that's the video library, coaching, and the course. So let's see what happens when we test whether they work or not. All right, so this is our very first study of the coaching intervention, where we tested the coaching against a control group, and these are observations over the course of the year, our year from September to June. And this is for language modeling. It's one of those instructional support scales. So here you see the control group. That's not a significant decline, but they're flat over the course of the year. And here you see a significant rise over the course of the year in the language modeling skills of the teachers. Remember I talked about sort of thinking whether under riskier conditions things matter more. Well, these are what happens when a teacher is teaching a class where 100% of the children are below the poverty line. So we took that as an indicator of that being a tougher classroom to teach in, and the idea is that teachers might need a little more support in that kind of classroom. Same kind of result, except this time we see over the course of the year, this is actually a significant decline in the quality of language modeling over the course of the year. So things get worse in those classrooms over the course of the year. And when they're coached, we reverse that decline and, in fact, turn it into a positive. Okay? So overall, in that particular study, just to kind of summarize, we saw that these teachers grew more sensitive. The kids' engagement increased. I just showed you the language stimulation techniques went up. These high poverty classrooms benefit. And we actually found that early career teachers, they benefited from coaching, but they also benefited just from going to the video library to be able to see examples of effective teaching. The kids in those classrooms where teachers were receiving these benefits, the kids made greater gains in the tests of literacy, lower levels of problem behavior, and higher levels of expressive language. We then took that study to try to replicate it, where we tested the course, and we're testing, again, my teaching partner in a replication study. This is with a second study to follow that first one. And we assessed outcomes at a number of different times. We assessed that the teachers first got the course, and then they got coaching. So we assessed teacher outcomes after the course, then in the middle of the coaching year, the end of the coaching year, and then we followed the teachers again the year after they got coached, okay, to see how things were going then. So these are the effects of this college course on observations of the teachers right after the course, which is the green bar, okay, and then a year later. And here you see basically these are effect sizes. These are middle of the range effect sizes, so the course improved teachers' emotional support, but really improved teachers' instructional support. And the course was focused on instructional support because that's so low, right? And in fact, that effect on instructional support is present a year after these students took this course. So I like to say it's nice to be a dean of a school of education and have conducted an experiment on a course that actually improves practice out in the field. This may be the only time that happens in my career. And we think I'll try to just summarize this quickly, but we think this, so we have this course that has this effect on instructionally supportive interactions. And we did some assessments of the teacher's skills in being able to observe interactions as a result of the course. And that assessment of their observation skills accounted for the effects of the course on their behavior. So essentially what it looks like is that if we can train teachers to observe interactions and develop that skill, their own skill of observing, and develop a language and a lens for interactions, that's what seems to be translating into the classroom to help them be more effective with interacting with kids in the classroom. Okay? So we saw these teachers demonstrate these changes in beliefs and knowledge and skills. We saw this effect on practice that was sustained a year later. The course was effective for a range of teachers. So we gave this course to teachers who just had a 2-year associate's degree, and we gave this course to teachers who had a master's degree. Everybody got better. It didn't matter what your background was. And it seemed to promote these interactions through this function of kind of being able to see. And this VAIL is the acronym we use for that particular assessment. Okay, this study, as I said, also tried to replicate this coaching, my teaching partner coaching effect that I reported earlier. So in this study, we scaled up to give coaching. The first study of coaching was really only to about 80 teachers. In this particular study, we're scaling this up to 250 teachers in 10 different sites across the country, and we're scaling this up using local coaches, not coaches that we've trained at the university and that work for me at the university. We focused most of the coaching on instructional support, and we tried to standardize things. And so we see, again, these very robust effects of coaching on these features of instructional support. So again, we see the thing that we're focusing coaching on, we're seeing gains on that in the classroom. And in fact, in this particular slide shows that these are sort of cycles of coaching over the course of the year. And these are the percentages of teachers who are exposed to different cycles. I'll try to break this down quickly. But essentially it shows that at the beginning of the year we focused on emotional support and that dropped off. We spent a little bit of time in the middle of the year focusing on organization. But by the end of the year, most of the focus was on instructional support. And so not surprising, remember that's the result we see. So the thing that we focus on in the coaching is the outcome that we get from kids, or from teachers. So that sounds like kind of a common sense rule, right? You know, sort of if you want a particular outcome, focus your intervention around that outcome. And in point of fact, we spent a lot of the government's money figuring that out. Okay. But what we also have done is to try to understand a little bit more about these features of coaching that seem to matter. So that as a part of the coaching, the teachers get exposure to video, and they also get exposure to these prompts that the coach is writing to them, right? And so they get exposure to those in those three domains. So we're wondering whether, is it the video that seems to matter? Is it watching yourself on video? Or is it getting these prompts that seem to matter? And this is sort of a convoluted and complicated story here, but this last bullet is really the point. We see a general pattern, okay, in which if you want to change instructional support, and that's the thing, remember, that's the lowest thing, remember, and essentially it needs the more intensive and more individualized written feedback to the teacher, okay. Those prompts will change instructional support, and in fact, it takes about 15 prompts on instructional support to see significant growth that I showed you, and then it kind of levels off. So if you get more than that, we're wondering whether that's really a kind of a ceiling effect, or whether there may be different teachers who are more or less responsive to that. But for emotional support, we find that just watching video is enough to change emotional support. And in fact, if teachers accumulate about 16 minutes worth of video watching of teachers demonstrating instructional support in the video library, that we see this, that they're accumulating and they're getting closer to 16 hours. And by the time they hit 16 hours, then we start seeing an increase in their behavior in the classroom. So these are kind of tentative results, and I don't want to make the story more complicated. But in a sense, what they're showing us is that there may be different mechanisms of change that are responsible for change in different areas of practice. Okay, and we at least think that that instructional support, which is generally very low and is the toughest thing to change, needs the most intensive professional development to move, if we're going to move it. Okay. All right, so then you might ask, are there any effects of this professional development this time around on child outcomes? And in fact, we see those as well. So we test for child outcomes in the coaching year and in the following year. And we find that in the areas of literacy, language development, and self-regulation, we don't see effects in the concurrent coaching year. We saw that in the initial coaching study. We didn't see it in this coaching study. And we think that's because, if you're coaching a teacher, it takes a while for the teacher's practice to get better, okay? So the kids aren't exposed to a whole year of effective teacher. They're exposed to about 4 or 5 months of effective teacher. But in fact, the teacher's effectiveness hangs in there the second year, okay? New group of kids, and those kids are the ones that are benefiting the most in that second year because they're exposed to a whole year of dosage of this effective teacher. And so for those children in that second year, we see that my teaching partner, the teacher having received my teaching partner coaching the year before, those children increased their self-regulation and working memory skills and their literacy, particularly in classrooms that had a decent literacy curriculum. Okay? So this combination of both teacher-child interactions and curriculum was particularly important in the area of literacy. Teacher-child interactions were enough to change working memory and self-regulation. Okay, so I think just to kind of move on with some implications, we think that effective professional development interventions indeed can be delivered locally. We learned that. We can support local coaches, and local coaches can deliver this fairly complicated but very standardized coaching process. That the quality of implementation of that process matters for teachers. I didn't go into this a lot, but it matters a lot when an effective model is implemented with fidelity. Okay, we went to great length to ensure fidelity in our local coaches. We wanted them to do what we asked them to do. When they did it, and they did it, we saw the effects that we did. So you just can't sort of set things loose and hope they work. You have to provide supports that, for implementation at fidelity. And in fact, these implementers need focus support. With our coaches, we did bi-weekly check-in calls with them. And one of the cool things about this coaching model, since it's on the internet, is that essentially there's a record of what the coach did with the teacher. I can, at any time, I can call up a coach's prompts that she's writing to the teacher and see if she's doing a good job with writing prompts, or I can see if she's meeting with the teacher in the way that she should be. Okay, just very quickly, we've done the exact same coaching study in secondary classrooms, and we see that, again, this is in all content areas. The average student whose teacher was coached jumped 10 percentile ranks on the high-stakes standards test that the state of Virginia gives. So we saw a big effect on student achievement in the 6th, 11th grade. This slide actually says we're replicating this in another city. While I was traveling here, those results were finalized, and I have to change that now to the past tense. We've replicated these results so that, in effect, we're seeing the same result that I put up there as we replicate this coaching model in another city. And again, I think what we're seeing here in the secondary grades is that we're activating the capacity of these classrooms for kids to promote development. These kids are more engaged, they're more involved in learning. And it isn't all about content. Content's important, but it's not all about content in those secondary grades too. Okay, and then finally, just to run through this really quickly, we're building an online course. We're trying to take that course and build it in an online model that basically tries to train teachers around these skills of knowing and seeing, and then thinking about how knowing and seeing connect to doing in the classroom. And this online course is really oriented around building this capacity to see effective teaching. Remember I was saying how important we thought that capacity is. So we spend a lot of time focusing through this video library and reviewing of your own video. And so these are kind of the rhythm of the online course, where you get online content, you're looking at videos of other people, you're analyzing your own video in a peer interaction context online, and you talk with your instructor online. And these are just some examples of what the online content of the course. This is actually a tagging exercise that teachers have. They go onto the website. In this case, they're trying to learn about analysis of a regard for student perspectives, one of our class dimensions. And the teachers who are taking the course have to tag this video. So there's right and wrong answers about the examples of regard for student perspectives in that video. And an individual teacher taking the course will tag those and then get feedback about whether they were correct in identifying those examples and have an opportunity to practice that skill. So it's trying to practice that observation skill. Okay, and this is just a more example of that. So we think, at the end of the day, we can measure interactions, we can label them and describe them, we can measure them, and we can improve them, and we can do that at a reasonable level of scale. So these standardized, and I would argue valid observations can be scaled and integrated into teacher preparation. We're now using the My Teaching Partner coaching model as the way in which we are doing supervision of our student teachers when they go out in the field. We're building some of these, the course for some of these, the coursework in here. We talked earlier today about how that's being used in the Masters of Teaching courses here. And I think this issue of how powerful it can be, particularly for new teachers, to have a common language and a common lens. It's important, though, that the common language and the common lens for practice is also a valid one, right? Because we could all make up a language and a lens, but it might be the wrong one. And I think what we're saying here is that it can also be important to have that validated. Really important to think about, as we move into the world of observation, as we move into the world of teacher assessment, as we move into the world of moving observation and teacher assessment into teacher preparation, that we have good solid metrics, strong technical properties. We pay attention to the importance of training. I mean, we should be approaching our work on observation and on teacher improvement as an engineering problem, as much as we try to approach it as a philosophical problem. In fact, we probably spend way too much time on the philosophy of this and less, in my view, on what ought to be the engineering of it. Core metrics, solid approaches that have evidence behind them are the mechanisms through which we can actually scale these kind of tools more broadly. Capacity is important, so this is about training observers and building up capacity to do this work. And in our experience, and I think this is borne out in the work that many of you are doing here, that you build up a cadre of people who are proficient in the language and the lens, and that can kind of expand itself over time. That this is not an impossible thing to do. We actually trained 2,000 observers to be able to go out and I was thinking of this today as you were talking, we trained 2,000 observers to be able to go out and observe in 50,000 Head Start classrooms in a matter of 4 months. So these things can be done. I think it's just a matter of sorting out the logistics and the technical support. And then finally, this issue of aligned professional development. We can improve interactions. If we have a target for what it is that we want our professional development to change, we train our resources on that target. And with aligned professional development, we can make that the dollars that are invested in professional development really make a difference for teachers' practice and make a difference for kids ultimately. Lots of implications for teacher preparation. How do we build portfolio assessments, portfolios for teachers as they demonstrate their competencies? How does that connect to licensure and certification? These are really important issues to beginning to think about. We're thinking about them a lot in the States. And at the end of the day, I am quite hopeful that at least the evidence that we've been able to generate, and I think several other colleagues have been able to generate, is that when we start focusing on practice and we use rigorous methods for assessing and describing practice and improving practice, we can really improve outcomes for teachers and kids. Thanks.